Welcome, everybody, to the Mona Charen Show. I am delighted to be joined today by Greg Lukianoff, who is the author of many wonderful books that have been on my shelf for a long time. And one of the most recent of which I want to talk about today. But just so you know, Greg heads the FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And he is the co-author of two books that are probably, at this point, considered part of the national conversation. The first one was called The Coddling of the American Mind, which he co-wrote with Jonathan Haidt. And the most recent one, and the main focus of our podcast today, was called The Canceling of the American Mind, that he co-wrote with Ricky Schlott. So welcome very much, Greg. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mona. Yeah, and the paperback is coming out on the 29th of April. We pushed it back so far, partially because we didn't want it to be anywhere near the election or the inauguration, because we knew things would be crazy. But
Sure.
Of course, things are still crazy.
Exactly. I'm afraid we're living in an era when there isn't any non-crazy window.
I've been saying I miss dull moments.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay. So let's begin with a little bit of introduction about you. So you are a lawyer, and you started out your legal career by interning at the American Civil Liberties Union, right?
Yep. Yeah, no, I went to law school specifically to do First Amendment. Like I took every class that Stanford offered on First Amendment and free speech. When I ran out, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty, which I actually had found to be like really useful research, surprisingly.
Yeah.
Then I interned at the ACLU. So this was my reason to go to law school in the first place.
So what did you find at the ACLU? What year would that have been?
That was 1999. It was the ACLU of Northern California, and it was, to be honest, and talk about this in the book, it was really kind of disappointing. On my very first day, I got dressed down by a fellow whose specialty was gay rights for complimenting the ACLU for defending the Nazis at Skokie. And he got mad about it. It was weird. And he started saying, well, we don't defend harassment. And I was like, who mentioned anything about harassment? I didn't say anything about that. So you could see some of this. Stanford was one of my first experiences of sort of like elite anti-free speech kind of norms. But I wasn't expecting to see more free speech skepticism at the ACLU than I was expecting. It's Northern California, so it was kind of ahead of the sort of what might be now called wokeness kind of trends. Mm-hmm. And there were great free speech lawyers at that office, to be clear. But it was also like, wow. And I call it in the book a slow motion train wreck that essentially like from that point on, I was like, oh my God, there's been an effort, and I knew this already, but I started taking it much more seriously, to change the political valence of free speech to one that is more right-coded than left-coded that it used to be, as a way of sort of using it and then abandoning it once you're in charge. We saw this change coming, but I worked my career to try to stop it and make sure that free speech was something that was defended and appreciated on all sides of the spectrum. But I think, we failed.
Yeah. It used to be just absolutely axiomatic that everybody was in favor of free speech, left, right, and center.
Yep.
And when I was young, everybody knew the Voltaire quote. Well, not
Yes.
everybody, but I may not like what you say, or you paraphrase, I may not like what you say, but I'll defend to the death your right to say it.
Yep.
And then I began to notice this tendency it started on the left, but it is by no means remained there.
Yeah.
Of saying, well, actually, there are other values that are more important than free expression. So among those, and in your book, which I highly recommend, say it again, The Canceling of the American Mind, you give many examples of the ways in which the arguments that people advance against free expression. So they say things like, well, isn't this just underprivileged people finally getting a voice?
Yeah.
So how do you respond to that critique?
I have a hard time not taking that argument so seriously because I always hear this in the most affluent settings.
Right.
Because I one of the things that was a little different about me getting to a place like Stanford is I come from a much poorer background. I started working in restaurants when I was 11.
Really? That's against the law.
Well, I believe in child labor laws, just not when they're applied to me, because I had some money to make, and I enjoyed working in restaurants.
Interesting.
I have very happy memories doing that.
This is interesting. So what did your parents do for a living?
My parents were divorced, and my mom went back to medical, nursing school, because she was a nurse in England, but that's something you can actually learn how to do in high school. So she'd done that, but America didn't recognize that. So when my dad was unemployed for a long time, she had to start going back to school. So when I was a kid, she was actually getting her nursing degree. So my mother was a nurse, and my dad was unemployed for a lot of time. But he's smart. He speaks 7 languages, and so when we got kicked out of the house, he took a job abroad at doing simultaneous interpretation.
Wow. Interesting. Okay. So proceed. You say this argument is made by people who tend to be...
Yeah. It tends to be made by very privileged people themselves. And a lot of times it's a way of just justifying a pre-existing censorship instinct and a desire to actually silence people you disagree with. And one of the things that I think really made me understand the importance of freedom of speech was being a editor of the school, one of the editors of the school newspaper. And you see, almost every week someone comes in and explains why you should fire that reporter or withdraw that story or apologize for something. And I started to realize they don't know why yet. They haven't figured out what their rationale is, and they're going to figure out whatever rationale they can hook on. So you'd actually watch kind of the gears turning. It's like, you should withdraw that story, or you should apologize for that story. And then I ask why. And intimidation, the rationale, the instinct comes first, the rationale comes later, which is one of the reasons why one of the things that got me very interested in psychology as well. So I think that we spent a lot of time, thanks to people like Richard Delgado, one of the early champions of speech codes, Mary Matsuda, a lot of the founders of critical race theory, trying to figure out ways to justify top-down censorship if it's done from the left, but of course appealing to kind of lefty ideas. And that was something that there used to be a huge element of the left, a dominant element of the left. That was like, no way, that's ridiculous. And even in the sort of free speech wars of the 1980s, like the political correctness wars, it seemed like the libertarian or the civil libertarian left had won this argument. But unfortunately, as I started to learn when I started at FIRE way back in 2001, that what was actually happening is, they won the argument in the court of public opinion. They won the argument in the courts. But in the departments themselves, this idea of, this Marcusean idea of the good people should be able to silence the bad people just kept on metastasizing.
Yeah. Okay. So one more on this. Why is it not just being sensitive and being polite? You frequently hear that there's no such thing as cancel culture. What we're really seeing is just sensitivity and politeness and not wanting to upset people by using offensive words and language. And by the way, I'm against offensiveness. Let me just
well, it's funny. My mom's British, as I mentioned. Yeah. So I'm a fairly polite person, which makes it kind of funny that I got into First Amendment. But also my dad's Russian, and he believes in brutal honesty. So you can kind of see that tension leading to me to be very pro free speech. So yeah, the argument that essentially it's about civility, it's about politeness, that's something that, and we come back to him a lot because I think he's a genius. John Stuart Mill pointed out in 1859 and On Liberty, he said that, we make this argument about civility, but the question is, whose civility? And it's generally made by the dominant people in any environment. And it's their definition of civility. And what does that actually look like in reality? That looks like if you're opposing the power structure's view, then you're pretty much by definition being uncivil to question it. But if I'm being even objectively super rude defending the view of power, well, then that's just righteous rage. Because civility is one of these ideas. It's different from year to year. It's different from person to person. It's different among economic classes. It's different between genders. It's different between religion. And America being as incredibly diverse as it actually is, it makes sense that we have this thing that we call the bedrock rule, which comes from a case called Texas v. Johnson, the great flag burning case of 1989, in which it says that you cannot ban speech just on ideas of civility alone. Like it cannot be just because someone finds it offensive, because that's just too subjective. That's just too changeable.
Yep. So describe, if you would, some of the. So you have this rubric in the book. The perfect rhetorical fortress and the efficient rhetorical fortress. That's kind of a mouthful, but I think what you're describing is the habits of mind that have been inculcated in recent years that prevent people. I mean, one of the things that happens when you have speech codes or when you have canceling is that people attempt to end run actual encounters with one another and argumentation by these cheats, these shortcuts where they can just dismiss the other person's arguments by dismissing either their background, their person, their privilege, something. Talk about those, the way the two sides have evolved on this.
Yeah, in this book we introduce, in Coddling the American Mind, we had this idea of these three great untruths, like this kind of bad advice that everybody gets and that goes against modern psychology and ancient wisdom.
It was a brilliant intro to that book, by the way. I loved that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah,
the sage in the mountains or whatever it was who tells you the great truths. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, Mesoponos. That came out of, I talked to John at one point when we were going really into the deep into the weeds of like intersectionality and that kind of stuff, that we were starting to write a book that I didn't want to read.
I hear you.
And so we wanted to make it more accessible, like really crystallize the idea. And so the first great untruths from Coddling the American Mind are: what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Terrible advice. Always trust your feelings. Sounds nice. Also terrible advice. And life is a battle between good people and evil people. And for canceling, we added a fourth great untruth, which is bad people only have bad ideas. Because when we look at the way we argue, and we call this the great untruth of ad hominem, the way we argue in social media, but also on campus, so much of it is related to, is this person bad, not is this person right? And we try to lay out like all the different ways we rely on ad hominems. We have something that we call we talk about the tactics that both sides use, and we call that the minefield and no man's land. The obstacle course of no man's land, and that includes like classic, argumentative tactics, and then it gets increasingly into ad hominem approaches, including one term that I come back to a lot: hypocrisy projection, which is like immediately accusing someone of being a hypocrite when you're actually being a hypocrite yourself. And we see this all the time in free speech cases. FIRE gets this all the time, and this actually just happened again last week. Where's FIRE on this case? Like you're silent on the Columbia thing. And I had to be like, I'm literally quoted in the article that you're tweeting.
Aren't you representing Mahmoud Khalil?
We're not representing him, but we did submit an amicus brief. We've been doing a lot of talking about that. I think he's got his own lawyer.
Oh, okay.
But we've been front and center, on the Mahmoud Khalil thing. But it was also kind of like, you didn't even read 5 inches into the story, dude. Yeah. So we talk about hypocrisy projection, but then we get, and those are the ones that everyone uses. But then we get into the perfect rhetorical fortress, which is the just Byzantine layer after layer of excuses to not actually address someone's argument that you see that grew up on the left. And it's so complex, partially because a lot of it grew up in academia, and it's just layer after layer after layer of this is why I don't need to listen to what you're actually arguing. And so the first one, of course, just like it is on the right, is labeling someone right wing. Like that. That's immediately something where you're like, which is frankly the same way of calling them a bad person. It's ad hominem, and then you don't have to listen to them. And this one has worked so well. You'll notice that at some point, everyone's been accused of being right wing who's like to the right of Karl Marx. The New York Times, when they started accusing the New York Times of being right wing, or the ACLU of being right wing, you could start to see like that they're probably getting the limit of the utility of that argument. And then I also make the argument, FIRE is not. I'm not a conservative. FIRE isn't a conservative organization, but I resent even the implication that. Why would that even matter? It's one of these things. How does that automatically make someone wrong? But that's just level one of the perfect rhetorical fortress. Then we get into all the demographic ways that you can dismiss someone for being white, or for being non-transgender, being cis, or for being straight. All of these things, and then after going through like 5 levels of this and showing you that this gets you down to like 99.3% of the population if you layer these on top of each other. And of course, the 0.7 can be immediately filled by calling them right wing. But even if you find someone who is a gay trans person of color, if they say they have the wrong opinion, they get dismissed as well. And actually, sometimes the vitriol is even worse. So for example, we talked to every black moderate and black conservative like author that we're like friends with. Every single one of them said they have been told that they're not really black for an opinion that they had. Coleman Hughes had a great quote on this. He was like, "Yeah, no, I'm always told that like my color is the most important thing for my opinion on all sorts of issues. But then when I give an opinion that oftentimes upper class white people don't like, they tell me I'm not really black. So magnificent. This is invincible. This is a perfect rhetorical fortress." And that's only level 6. I feel like the lowest version of this, the one that I listed last that I see come up when like schools do this a lot, when they're really desperate, they darkly hint that something else is going on here. They did this to Nicholas Christakis at Yale, for example, where like, okay, fine, like those students treated him awfully back in 2015 by calling him disgusting for his wife writing an email that basically said we shouldn't really be telling students what Halloween costumes to wear. That doesn't
actually
seem like
let's dwell on this for a minute,
Sure.
because we need an example, and this is a great one. So this is from Yale University a few years ago. Some viewers, listeners may have seen the video that went viral at the time, but let's set it up. So Erica and what was the husband's
Nicholas.
name? Nicholas were husband and wife. They both taught at Yale. And that year, I guess one of the administrators, I don't know if it was a DEI administrator or whoever it was, sent around an advisory before Halloween, basically telling the students to watch out about the costumes they wore, don't engage in cultural appropriation, and don't do this and don't do that. And she, Erica Christakis, wrote a note or an email out to people, I don't know where she published it, saying, actually, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think, if you see something that is offensive, talk to each other, engage, don't, and basically what she was saying is she wanted to treat the students like grown-ups, who could make these decisions by themselves and encounter one another. Okay, you take over. Then what
Sure.
happened?
Well, and it's important to remember the context here. This is 2015. It was a single semester that was completely dominated by a sudden explosion of sort of proto-Black Lives Matter protesting on campus. And this started at University of Amherst, where students went after UMass Amherst, where they went after a publication for saying that cops aren't that bad, to try to get them defunded. So there are about 100 or more of these incidents that all happened over a very concentrated period of time. There was a website called what is it, the terms or something like that. That was all the demands the students were making. So this is a time, frankly, when people were looking for reasons to protest. To be frank. But in this case, I think it was like the Multicultural Student Center or something like that sent out this email.
Okay.
And this was also a phenomenon going back 10 years. I remember actually there was one, first started talking about the war on Halloween because I was like, forget the war on Christmas. The war on Halloween is much more interesting. The craziest one was 2010. I think it was at Cornell. And they sent out a warning that went even farther, saying that students who are seen in offensive costumes may be asked to disrobe. And I was like, okay, wow, that could get weird and wrong quick.
Yes.
So this has been happening for a while, and Erica's a developmental psychologist, and she's kind of like, no, like she made a classic argument about student autonomy. Is this our business? Can't they handle this themselves? Can't students be transgressive? It was a defense of the students' independence. And this got treated, and to this day, to the shame of people at Yale, people popped up out of the woodwork to say, oh, like Erica Christakis was saying that they should wear blackface. It's like, oh, for God's sake, she never said that.
Of course not.
And it's dishonest for you to claim that that's what she was saying. So anyway, students, organized, they surrounded Nicholas Christakis in the quad, shouting at him, and he was just there to defend his wife and defend free speech. And did you know, I took the video there, right?
I did not know that.
Yeah, because I was there.
Oh my gosh.
I was there. I was there coincidentally. Of course, this became like a conspiracy theory to talk about freedom of speech.
Oh my goodness.
And I'd been invited the previous spring, had no idea there'd be this calamity going on. And so I videotaped it because it was getting intense and ugly. And I know enough to say, like, what's going to happen here is the students are going to claim that he got out of line. And I need to show that he's showing superhuman patience and grace in a situation where students are yelling in his face about being
really
disgusting and like, what are you doing here, and all this stuff. And it was one of the more depressing things.
I think one of them said, according to your book, who the fuck hired you?
Who the fuck hired you? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the one sad thing about taping it, since I was kind of holding over my head and I put up the tape, the things, is I missed a beat, and the student who got called Screeching Girl was actually just following, basically did the exact same thing that another student had done right before her. So like it had become this kind of like almost like ritualistic pylon thing. And
by the way, I saw an interview with Nicholas Christakis later, and he refused to say, he was very distressed on behalf of the girl in the video because he didn't want any bad things to happen to her because of this encounter. He was very protective. It was interesting. But anyway, go on.
Oh yeah. No, well, this is funny. Like one thing that we absolutely did not do, and we were clear on this, is we didn't say any of the names. We didn't focus on the students at all. Mm-hmm. And then like the Daily Caller decided to out the student.
Of course.
And I condemned that. I was like, no, this is missing the point. This is not what we're trying to do here.
Right.
And I've condemned it repeatedly. But do I think that the students were acting acting good? No. I think they were being incredibly unfair to an incredibly decent, incredibly patient man and his wife.
Yes.
So what happened there was the university was very hesitant to say anything publicly standing by them. They did it in a little bit of a gradual and mealy-mouthed kind of way. Erica would never teach again at Yale. She was really shocked and disappointed by the whole thing. And Nicholas and her left as being the masters of Silliman Hall. Like they ran this residential college, is what they call it, where basically a big part of their role was to have people like me to come in as speakers and talk to them. But they stepped down from that. Students, when they were at graduation, students were refusing to take their diplomas from them. One of the students, by the way, who led the circle and the berating of Nicholas, got an award from Yale, for this.
For this?
For well, not specifically for for that, but he got like a got a commendable student
Good
award.
citizenship.
Yeah, exactly.
God.
And so this was really shameful. But then I'm even more annoyed because there's a whole chapter on Yale and canceling the American mind.
Yes.
In retrospect, I probably should have done a whole chapter on Harvard too. But
Carol Hooven. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Carol Hooven. Don't get me started about Carol. Just her mistreatment. But but the way Yale handled it afterwards was just shameful. How many times I would see someone saying, like, rewriting the entire incident as if they'd done something terrible. I mean, I always like to point out Michael Barabay and Jennifer Ruth when they wrote their attack on academic freedom called "It's Not About Free Speech." Really terrible book. One of the most bald-faced attacks on academic freedom I've ever read. They basically blame Eric, Nicholas, and Erica for being provocateurs, and their only evidence was that they once defended the free speech rights of a student back at Harvard back in 2012. And it's like, that's being a provocateur. So I think that the response to it, I mean, I think both of the Christakises deserved a massive apology.
Yeah, yeah. So let's just touch on a couple of other episodes just to give the flavor, because again, there are people who say this isn't a problem or it doesn't exist. So it's
but we also cite a ton of data.
I know you do. You cite a ton of data and examples, and you say the number of, for example, the number of professors who were either fired or disciplined or whatever vastly outstrips the number who were treated that way under the McCarthy era.
Yeah.
And now we have a new McCarthy era brought to us by the conservatives by the Republicans and the Trump people, but we'll get to that in a sec. Yeah. But just one or two more just quick
I appreciate
examples.
that you call them Republicans rather than conservatives.
Yeah. Yeah. So this Hamline University story is just unbelievable. I mean, this professor, I guess she was an instructor, art history, announces that she wants to, she's intending to show in an art history class, a portrait that was commissioned by a Muslim emir or something to celebrate something. And it was going to be a picture of the Prophet Muhammad. And her point was, and she said in the syllabus and in her instructions to the class, look, I know this is, many Muslims feel that any depiction of the Prophet is sacrilegious, but Islam is not monolithic. And my point is to show you that over history, there have been different views on this. And I'm going to show you this portrait, and it's interesting. And it was like from 14 something or whatever. And she announced it. And then she also put an announcement, I think, before that class saying that anybody who in the room who might be made uncomfortable by this was welcome to, not participate, leave the class. And anyway, despite all of that, she was still, there was a complaint, and then she was hounded. Yeah. So just tell me a little bit about what happened to her.
Yeah, no, this is a pretty terrible case. And yeah, they did the whole thing where they had the talk back, which is never really a talk back, where she's just kind of berated, and a student claimed, that she was like really badly shocked and hurt by this. And of course, it's like she gave plenty of warning that this, and again, this is devotional art. This isn't, like the Muhammad cartoons. This is something like, by a Muslim artist as well, in addition to being, commissioned by a Muslim. And the university just did not have her side, and she was not hired back for Hamline University in kind of a spectacular way. I mean, the only good news here is that it did bring together the entire free speech community, including groups that sometimes don't seem to care as much about cases that are more about political correctness. But so the response was good. But the students herself, she's never gotten her job back. The university would say things sometimes that indicated that they regretted it, and then reverse themselves and basically say that they were right on, and this showed respect to the Muslim students there. So yeah, that we use that as one of the opening examples, partially because it happened like right as we were finishing the book, and we're like, anyone who says that this cancel culture is over is just not paying attention.
Before we get to the right-wing cancellation, which is rampant, can you say a word about why free speech is so important to our society? What is at stake here?
Yeah, I mean, you don't really have a free society if you don't have free speech. Like free speech makes free people. We have a T-shirt that says that, and there are all different sorts of reasons, for defending it. But the most basic in a democracy is like, what does it mean to not have free speech in democracy? It means you barely have a democracy if there's not things that you can talk about. You're talking about something more like oligarchy. But I have an idiosyncratic theory of free speech, which is I call the pure informational theory of free speech. But I talk about, if the humanist project is to know the world as it is, you have to know what people really think. You have to, or you don't understand the world in which you live. That's it. Key data in understanding the world is understanding what people really believe. And that includes, by the way, their misconceptions. But then again, so much of what we all believe right now, we're going to discover later, are misconceptions, and we don't even know it. So I think that free speech...
Well, that kind of modesty is very important to the search for truth, right?
Absolutely. And again, it's essential for the search for truth. It's essential, and the fact of opinions is a kind of truth, itself. And then, of course, when you're arguing about freedom of speech, you're not just arguing about free speech in a philosophical vacuum. You're always arguing it in a context of someone saying that someone should have power over that. Because no one is saying that words can't hurt people. Of course they can. Words are powerful, or else they wouldn't really matter. We wouldn't, need to regulate them because they'd be irrelevant. We wouldn't have any desire to either. But when it comes to giving this power over to someone, they're going to use their own biases. They're going to decide what they think goes too far. So the idea that censorship actually fixes things or won't naturally devolve into the interests of power. It almost immediately devolves into what power wants, as we see time and time again.
And free speech is more important for minorities than for the majority, right?
Oh yeah, no. I talk about this as being. I feel like young people are taught today, and they come in kind of believing that free speech is the argument of the three Bs: the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. And I have to explain, okay, this is bad history. And first of all, the robber baron, by which I mean wealthy and powerful people, have never needed a special protection for freedom of speech because they have wealth and power. And when it comes to the bully and the bigot in a democracy, in a pure democratic society, if they have the votes, they call the shots. You literally only need a special protection for freedom of speech for two types of people: people unpopular with the majority and people unpopular with powerful people. And I have to explain this over and over again. And one of the reasons why campuses sort of de-emphasize this is they don't like to admit they're the man now.
That's such a great point that you make in the book, is that this is part of why campuses, at least elite campuses, tend to be so left-leaning and woke. And it's because they have a little bit of a guilty conscience about the fact that they are the elite, and that they are kind of anyway, you say it better than I can, please.
Well, President Botstein at Bard, in the conclusion, he says this wonderful quote about so much of what might be called wokeness, is a guilty conscience on having these nominally, pro egalitarian people in these incredibly exclusive, highly paid, class privilege recapitulating, systems that they feel guilty about, and that guilt. And I saw this when I was at Stanford. That it seemed kind of like So I had a friend who he thought this quote came from Philip Roth, but then we could never find it. Was the '90s was the era when we started to think that feeling bad was doing enough, which I thought was great. But I noticed this among some of my friends who didn't. I actually went into public interest, but I knew people who their identity was so tied up in being like a good progressive. That
and you were a progressive, right? And you think of yourself
I would never describe myself as a progressive. I was always a liberal.
A liberal, okay.
And that's a very Gen X thing. Is that the left in the '90s had kind of by that time had sort of embarrassed themselves, like the kind of people who have come back now, like the tankies. The people who think Stalin wasn't that bad. Yeah. They disappeared for a while there, and they've unfortunately come back. So, but being like
I tangled with them in the '70s. Well, 80s.
Oy.
80s. Yeah, they were.
Yeah, I mean, Grigory Vasilyevich Lukianoff has some opinions on this.
Well, then they used to say that China was just too big to have democracy, therefore they needed Mao.
Oy.
Anyway, sorry, digression.
Yeah. But what I was saying was, so a lot of these, in some cases friends went to work for big law firms, but it was kind of like they felt like if they were especially radical in their hearts, that could somehow make up for this sort of, what's the word, cognitive dissonance that they had about this. And you see a lot of this on campus, like as if like the feeling radical, somehow insulates you from moral culpability.
Yeah. Okay. So let's turn to the right's version of this.
What do you mean?
Doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So the left has power at the universities.
Yes, definitely.
And they abuse it.
Yep.
And the right doesn't have power at the universities, although now they're trying to impose it from the outside. But they do have electoral power.
Yes.
And they're abusing that. So
you don't say.
So let's talk about some of the things that are in the book about, for example, what Ron DeSantis did in the state of Florida. But it's not just Florida. There are many, many states that are passing legislation that is explicitly anti-free speech.
Yeah. Well, I do actually want to challenge that, though.
Okay.
There are authors like Marianne Franks, like who like to pretend that there were like a million Stop Woke acts, passed all around the country, and other than ones that are vaguely reminiscent that have passed since then, the only one that really goes after curricular speech and is clearly unconstitutional that came out of this was actually in the state of Florida. And
okay.
To be clear, like. Not only did I called it laughably unconstitutional before they passed it, after they passed it, and then we defeated it in court.
Right.
We and just to give
I guess I was just referring to there were bills introduced in a bunch, Iowa
and FIRE did a lot
Arkansas,
to defeat
Oklahoma.
those bills. By the way, like we actually would go and talk to legislatures like no, and then there was one passed in North Carolina that actually just said that you can't force people to say things. You can't do compelled speech. And we're like, yeah, that's consistent with law, and we agree with that. Mm-hmm. But in Florida, oh my God, like I always feel bad for the poor lawyers who were forced to go into court to make this argument. Okay, under the Stop Woke Act, you can it doesn't restrict speech beyond like what the government's allowed to do, but under this you could go into a classroom and argue against affirmative action, but you can't argue for it. And it's like no. That's admitting that's unconstitutional. Like that's a no. That's
viewpoint discrimination.
Discrimination. So we defeated that pretty soundly, but it was a really bad law. I do point out, by the way, though, we also took on a law in California that had a sort of mandatory DEI ideology.
Tell us about that.
It said that in the community college system of California, which is huge, that professors would have to work in sort of a DEI terminology into their classrooms, into their syllabus, and that this is things like anti-racism and intersectionality. And we brought a lawsuit there too. And we had a great quote from a chemistry professor who challenged this, and I'm like, I'm not really sure how to express the anti-racist view on the atomic weight of boron, which I loved. And that one I think was easily as egregious as the Stop Woke Act, and that one got a tiny fraction of the attention. That did, but still, like the Republican attempts through legislatures. We've opposed them time and time again. And one of the reasons why there weren't more Stop Woke Acts is partially because we were intervening.
Yeah, excellent. They also passed in Florida what came to be called the Don't Say Gay bill. It was like parental rights in education or something. Yeah. And I have to say, I am sympathetic to the idea that you don't want to introduce certain topics into school at too young of an age. I don't want kindergarten and first grade kids being told about, that they could be one of many different genders, for example, and that kind of thing. But of course, this act was so badly worded and so vague that it could have. It's still in effect, right?
I believe it is, yeah.
Yeah.
So all of the curricular stuff is something that FIRE also tries to be very clear. We're very zealous, but we also try to be sensible and accurately explain the law. Government does have power over deciding what curriculum is in public schools.
Yes.
Otherwise, they shouldn't be publicly funded or mandatory. So when it comes to the power to pass a Don't Say Gay bill, it was within the power of the legislature to do that. But I was really moved by a lot of the great objections to it, including Sarah Longwell. Like she had one beautiful piece saying that this is so badly worded. My daughter is going to be afraid to talk about what her family looks like. It's a same-sex family. Jamie Kirkrick, who's also a gay American, wrote a beautiful explanation of like why they think this was so badly worded.
Right, and of course, on the right,
who are you going to say now?
Oh well, there's so much. I mean, the fact is that there is a really quite authoritarian and vicious crackdown on anybody on the right. See, David French has a really good point about this, where he says the targets of left-wing intolerance are usually people on the right, but the targets of right-wing intolerance are also people on the right because they're trying to silence, for example, anybody who, it's not always true. I mean, what they did to Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, for example, in 2020, where, the election workers who, were accused of trying to pass a thumb drive when it was a mint, and just crazy stuff. But they turned these people's lives upside down. There were death threats, Brad Raffensperger, Rusty Bowers. I mean, if you raise up your head and simply tell the truth, now among Republicans, you get canceled in a hurry.
Yeah. Well, and one of the chapters we talk a lot about, Trump's, fight against a lot of journalists, in the first administration. But all of this is just child's play compared to what's actually going on now, because we talk about, we have several chapters on cancel culture from the right. And actually David, our mutual friend David French plays quite a role in that.
Yes.
He gets targeted for hate from both sides, actually. So, good on him.
Yes.
But when it comes to what's going on now, I mean, like the approach to the media, the approach to law firms, this actually has fired. I'll be honest, I'm mildly spooked here because we are, and I think very rightfully, defending Ann Selzer in Iowa. Now, people might remember this name. She was a pollster, very reputable pollster, but her methods were a little bit out of date. And she did what would turn out to be her final big poll was a poll for the Des Moines Register, and it showed Harris ahead by 2 points in Iowa. And this became national news.
I remrember. It gave me such happiness for 45 minutes.
I think it did for a lot of Democrats. And I'm
not even a Democrat.
Right. And it got covered. everywhere. And it turned out she was very, very wrong. Now, she did a very classic thing, which is she explained how she got it wrong. She was using methods that included phone calls, which might have worked really well, which actually did work really well, even as little as 7 years ago, but just don't really anymore.
Yeah.
And she explained how she got it wrong, and then she retired, admitting she'd made a huge mistake. Because, Trump won handily in Iowa. But the Trump administration decided to sue her in his personal capacity under a consumer protection law in Iowa that's designed for basically like grossly false advertising. So it's about commercial speech. It has no application to someone doing a poll that's reported on. As far as the law is concerned, we consider this to be an incredibly easy case. But when you look at what the Trump administration has been doing to, Covington and Burling, to Perkins Co. These are all law firms.
Yeah.
To Paul Weiss. And now a couple additional ones. Ones who had been involved in, investigating some of the offenses that Trump was accused of. Some of them involved in some of the January 6th investigations. Even saying things like this law firm is now banned from going into federal court. They can't be let in the building, taking away their security clearance, for example. Basically anything that they can kind of get away with to settle old scores against the media. Against law firms and against the media. You had the lawsuit against ABC News. You have the giant lawsuit against 60 Minutes. It really is. It really does seem to be just filled with retribution
and an effort to chill expression.
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely.
Yeah.
to be clear,
and it is working.
Yeah.
Say a little bit about that.
Yeah, people are spooked. The 60 Minutes one is the one that I think I find the kind of the. The one hand, I can understand why people were annoyed about it, but also the idea that this wasn't within 60 Minutes' power to do. So 60 Minutes did a interview with Kamala Harris, and the first clip they showed of it was this kind of classic Kamala sort of word salad. But then when you actually went to see the interview at 60 Minutes, they actually did a clip that was much cleaner and much more coherent. And this got everybody, all up in arms. I remember even thinking to myself, I'm like, they're trying to do her a favor, But the idea that this is a crime.
I know. I was about to say that is not illegal last time I checked.
It's not illegal at all. This is editing. So it's a massive, absolutely crippling potential lawsuit against 60 Minutes. They demanded that the raw footage be released. 60 Minutes, by the way, released the raw footage, and then everybody watched it and they were like, so that was better than I thought it was going to be. I think there were a lot of us who were a little worried that the whole thing would have just been an ugly, embarrassing mess, and it was more like, okay, that's she's not the best in interviews, but this is there's nothing terrible about this. I've certainly sounded worse in interviews, but yeah, so absolutely massive lawsuit against 60 Minutes with the idea though of chilling speech, and of course in a lot of these cases. The groups are settling because they don't want retribution from the government in other ways. So this is why, Paul Weiss, to go back to the law firm, they felt like they were facing an existential threat. So they're promising the Trump administration something like $30 million. In $40 million.
My husband was a former partner at Paul Weiss.
Good Lord. In pro bono services. Just out of fear of retribution from the government. I mean, Facebook.
Well, that's it.
Yeah, this is crazy.
So nobody ever imagined that we would have a president who was willing to, just trash every restraint, every norm that we've ever observed, and so the federal government and the presidency are invested with huge power. And maybe, I don't know, if it's not too late, and who knows, we don't know the answer to this. Genuinely, we don't know whether we can come back from this as a vibrant democracy. But one lesson I hope people take away from this is how dangerous government is in the wrong hands. government is really dangerous. And so, Jeff Bezos, who was a staunch opponent of Trump in the first term, owner of the Washington Post, but owner of many other businesses, and has reason to know because he was targeted and seen as an enemy in the first Trump administration, has reason to know that his other businesses were at risk. And so he has decided to pretty much, put reins on the coverage and the editorial posture of the Washington Post, which is one of our major media institutions that we haven't lost it entirely, but we're losing it. And ABC, I don't know if you saw the examples of media people attempting to dance around the question of whether they should call the Gulf of Mexico when the astronauts splashed down, and they're saying the Gulf, or they really are frightened.
Yeah. And that was a case that we've almost forgotten about at this point. The exclusion of the AP, from the presidential pool. Because the AP continues to call it the Gulf of Mexico, and the AP makes the point, and I think this is a good point, is that's we're international. The rest of the world doesn't suddenly refer to it as the Gulf of America just because that's what the president says. And in that case, they were excluded. So
in your book, you talk a lot about how badly our universities need reform.
Yeah,
and I certainly agree with that. I think they've, become very parochial and blinkered in their points of view, and they need a lot more.
And overly bureaucratized. And
way overly bureaucratized. And you give chapter and verse about that. Yale has more administrators than students, or more. Yeah. It's nuts. But they desperately need reform. And I think maybe you mentioned it, or maybe I saw it somewhere else, but, that one idea is not to extend student loan assistance to students who attend universities that have an endowment over $20 billion or something like that. They can all afford to give free tuition to their students. It wouldn't be a stretch. But anyway, or at least to the needy students. So there are lots of things that need reform about our universities. But what's happening now is the heavy hand of the state coming in and really strong-arming universities. And as much as, I happen to have gone to Columbia, and I am grieved.
I'm pretty hard on Columbia overall.
Well, I completely agree. It grieves me what Columbia has become, because it has a really proud tradition and produced dozens of Nobel Prize winners, and it's an amazing school. But I want to hear you on this. What do you think about this, heavy-handed, Trump administration effort to, force universities to do what they want?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of higher ed reform, but there's ways you do it and there's ways you don't. And in this case, and there's certainly things that you ask for and things that you can't, or at least shouldn't. And so the unilateral decision to cut $400 million from grants to Columbia, about $250 million of which were from NIH, I believe.
Yeah.
That is, to say the least, a heavy-handed tactic. And while few people are more critical of Columbia's handling of the October 7th protests, like the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas protest, because there was absolutely anti-Semitic harassment. There was violence. There was vandalism. There was also things they just never had to allow under any argument, which is, indefinite camping. Like that's not you don't have a First Amendment right to have indefinitely set up a camp.
Time, place, and manner restrictions, right?
Exactly.
That's part of First Amendment law.
And one of the things that as far as shout-downs of student groups, the pro-Palestinian students have been terrible in this respect. Like, it's been the two worst years for shout-downs and mob censorship that we're familiar with, and it's overwhelmingly been pro-Palestinian. So we're second to no one on being critical of some of the threats threats to academic freedom and free speech that's arisen out of this. But using $400 million like sanction out of the blue, not following process, not following the way this potentially could be done legitimately, and also targeting, we might be like saying like, because the administration handled this so poorly, your grant to study cancer has been removed, and it's like whoa.
I know.
Like that seems to say the least short-sighted. But they also probably the two things that disturbed me the most was, one, they strong-armed Columbia into adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Now, to be clear, anti-Semitism is a problem in higher ed. It's a particular problem in elite higher ed, and in basically every school in California, as best I can tell. I don't know why, I've been front of the line saying we should reform, and so is FIRE. We should reform Title VI to make it clear that the same protections that apply to black students, for example, also protect Jewish students. And we've pushed for this reform. But the reason why we object to the IHRA definition is because it's something developed by this scholar at Bard called Ken Stern. And it's supposed to be like a sociological way of examining whether or not something's anti-Semitism. So it includes things like opinions about Israel in its list of things, in its definition of anti-Semitism. And that's our problem with it, is like you don't include viewpoints in something without running seriously afoul of the First Amendment. So we've always objected to this and made the point, like, listen, discrimination is a pattern of behavior. You could do this perfectly well without having this list of opinions. Why would you even give yourself a constitutional infirmity? Why would you actually give yourself that constitutional weakness? So we take a lot of, we got a lot of hate mail about opposing the IHRA, but it's like, no, this says, for example, an example of anti-Semitism that they give is treating Israel differently than you would treat any other country. And it's like, who doesn't do that to all sorts of countries? Like that's obviously something that you might think that's bad intellectually, but it's certainly protected.
Yeah. So I actually think there is an element of anti-Semitism in the tendency to hold Israel to a standard that no other nation is held to, but I wouldn't put it in the law.
No, I do too. Believe me. I'm always like, always pointing out, like, have you heard of the Uyghurs?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
have you heard of Putin?
Right.
Have you heard of Darfur?
Yeah, Darfur.
Precisely. I do think the special focus on. So I agree with it in spirit. I just don't, just like you, I don't want it in the law.
Yeah.
So we're in the sort of unusual position of, because Columbia finished, we have this amazing campus free speech ranking that's incredibly rigorous, has a ton of, and actually in the new paperback edition, we have the 2025.
So you've updated the list. Okay.
In the appendix.
Where's Columbia?
Second to last.
Oh, God, I'm not surprised.
Boy, did you earn it.
Yeah, I know. Oh, my gosh.
But you beat out Harvard.
Thank you. This is not at the same high level as our discussion about, the big issues of free speech, but it is interesting. I haven't heard anybody talk, and I wonder if you would, about the fact that in addition to the violations of, of free speech rights, when the government sort of unilaterally just says we're cutting off all this funding, those are actual contracts that the universities have made with the federal government. And the federal government is the party to a contract, and it can't just abrogate it without consequences. There could be damages to Columbia for breach. They'll have to go into the Court of Federal Claims. I mean, this is not, at least if we still have a functioning republic where the law still applies, it isn't really, they're not allowed to do that, right? Without consequence.
Well, that's one of this has led to a cycle. The administration does something that exceeds its powers. It gets slapped down in court. But now, like, some of the rhetoric that you're seeing on the right and from Trump himself about going after judges, that scares me to death.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is where we come. At the end of almost every conversation that I have, it comes to the moment of truth is coming, where whether they will obey court orders or not, and they are giving every indication that the answer is no. Like in the case of Judge Boasberg and the ripping people off the streets and sending them to a prison in El Salvador. He said, I'm going to deport people. He didn't say he was going to deport people without a hearing and to a prison, a horrible prison in a repressive country. And he knows it's horrible, and he's bragged about that.
Yeah.
This is brutality and autocracy at a level we've never seen.
Yeah. The Mahmoud Khalil case that we've been all over that we mentioned before, when they first mentioned that it was going to be a guy who they were talking about like he was an organizer of the protests, I was like, well, they probably could find something on him given how much illegal behavior actually took place at Columbia and Barnard. But then when they arrested him and they immediately tried to fly him to Louisiana in order to get a better forum in case as soon as a judge actually responded to this, they didn't even know that he was on a green card as opposed to a student visa when they showed up. And, the protections offered to green card holders are about, at least in theory, almost as good as what you have as a citizen.
Mm-hmm.
And we were kind of waiting for them to make an accusation that was more serious than, he was affiliated with the group that handed out some, flyers that I find
admittedly bad flyers. Yes.
Yeah, that seemed to be celebrating Hamas.
Yeah.
But they never said that he did it himself, and he was the negotiator for a lot of these places, which with the students. But I didn't actually realize when I first heard this that this was partially because Columbia liked him because they thought he was reasonable, and. At this point, the only argument that they've now made the argument that he left things off his visa application. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a stronger argument.
It is.
So why on earth they didn't start with that in the first place? I think they decided they were angry and they wanted to make an example of someone, and they didn't do their homework on who was a green card holder, moved him out, and then did the research later. So, and some of the cases that we're seeing pop up, in some cases they're removing people who have overstayed their visa. Well, they're out of luck.
Yeah.
But in other cases, I mean, this very recent one, where they can probably under the law get away with it. But this is a case where this was a green card holder since she was 7 who'd been in the United States. She got arrested actually at a protest at Columbia, and that's the justification that they're having for withdrawing her green card and kicking her out. Now, do I think legally they can do that? Probably. Do I think that there's something that should really give people pause that people are who've been here, they're kind of essentially their whole life? That should give people some pause.
And it should their insouciance about whether it's legal or not legal should make all of us, even those of us who are citizens, very, very nervous. Let me ask one more thing, and we can close on this, which is the assertion of power that the president is using on a lot of this is the Alien Enemies Act of 1789. And the act specifically says that this is a power to, to do some of these things that is for wartime, for when we are at war.
Yep.
And it seems to me, and tell me if you think this is not right, but it seems to me that to suggest that having some gang members from Venezuela in our country is equivalent to being invaded by a foreign army and therefore we are at war is so absurd that no court could look at that with a straight face and say, come on, you can't really seriously be calling this a wartime thing.
Yeah. Well, certainly given when the Alien Act came out, and of course I always want to say Alien Sedition Act.
I know, me too.
No, we're not talking about the Sedition Act. We're talking about just the Alien one. And I'm like, wow, that's a blast from the past.
Yeah.
Literally. And since it was in the time of the founders, they meant declared war. And just because we don't declare wars anymore, that's not the Constitution's fault. And so the argument that we're at war, with this particular, gang is hard to take seriously. Now, One of our big objections, though, and this is why I think even if you have no sympathy for some of the people being deported over the college protests, you should be concerned about the law that they're using to justify this. This is a law, I think it goes back to the Cold War, and it gives the Secretary of State, here Marco Rubio, of course, the power to deport someone if, in his estimate, they are adverse to our foreign policy goals. I'm like, that's incredibly vague, incredibly broad,
vague.
but clearly designed for something more like, okay, like a enemy of the state, spy has popped up in America, and it's an international incident that if we don't return this person to their country, like that's, and even there, I have issues with it. But it's so vague and so broad. I really appreciated someone on Twitter being like, "Would you, Jordan Peterson is here on either a visa or a green card. Like, do you want him to just be randomly kicked out? With the idea that even if Canada said nothing, that this is an international incident, for him to be here." So we're really focusing on that law. And by the way, the one time that provision has been challenged in court.
Yep.
It was found to be facially unconstitutional by Donald Trump's sister, who was a judge. She's passed, which is sad.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the case was overturned for completely different reasons. But it's never been challenged before or since. So we still believe like this is an extraordinary power to give to the soul. So no American should be comfortable with that kind of power for people who are here legally. People are here legally, to be clear.
Right. Okay. Well, Greg, thank you so much for clarifying so many of these things. Your book is coming out in paperback.
Yep.
The end of April. People
April
can pre-order.
29th. You can pre-order. It's all new data.
So all of you who have children or grandchildren who are heading off to college, this is also a good guide for you to know which schools to avoid. Greg, thank you so much for joining me.